I first noticed him on a cold October evening. The moving truck pulled up next door, its headlights casting long shadows across the street. A man stepped out, tall, thin, and wearing a dark hoodie that hid most of his face. He moved with an eerie precision, unloading boxes with methodical care, as if each one held something precious. I watched from my window, sipping my beer, my curiosity piqued. The house next door had been empty for months. No one wanted it after the last owner, a quiet old man, was found dead in his basement. Heart attack, they said. The place was old, creaky, and just a little unsettling. Now, it had a new occupant. The man barely interacted with anyone. The next morning, I saw Mrs. Caldwell, our friendly neighborhood gossip, try to welcome him with her infamous homemade pie. He opened the door just a crack, spoke in hushed tones, and quickly shut it. I caught a glimpse of his face then, pale skin, sunken eyes, and an expression devoid of warmth. Something about him set me on edge. That night, I heard the first noises. At first, I thought it was my imagination, muffled sounds, like dragging furniture. But as the hours passed, they grew stranger. A dull thud. A faint scraping. A low, almost inhuman moan. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Maybe he was just settling in. Maybe he was moving things around. Then came the scream. It was quick, sharp and desperate, but enough to send chills down my spine. I rushed to the window, but his house was completely dark. No lights. No movement. Just silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a stray animal, maybe a TV left on. But deep down, I knew something was off. And I was going to find out what. I barely slept that night. Every creak of my own house made me jump, every gust of wind against the window sent a shiver down my spine. I kept replaying the scream in my head, sharp, desperate, and cut off too soon. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it. Maybe I was just letting my paranoia get the best of me. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. That afternoon, I decided to do what any good neighbor would. I went to introduce myself. I knocked on his door, half hoping he wouldn't answer. A few seconds passed before I heard the locks turning. The door cracked open just enough for me to see one dark eye peering out. Yes. I forced a smile. Hey, I live next door. Thought I'd say welcome to the neighborhood. He didn't respond. Just stood there, staring. I cleared my throat. I heard some noises last night. Sounded like, well, I wasn't sure what. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, his lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. Just fixing up the basement, he said in a low, monotone voice. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Right, I nodded, trying to keep my voice casual. Well, let me know if you need any help. He didn't respond. Just shut the door. As I walked back to my house, I realized my hands were shaking. The noises get worse. That night, the sounds returned. At first, it was the same strange thuds and scraping noises. But around midnight, things got worse. There was a muffled voice, frantic, pleading. Then a bang, as if something heavy had hit the wall. Then silence. I grabbed my phone and hovered my finger over 911. But what would I even say? My neighbor is making weird noises. I think I heard someone. That wasn't enough. I needed proof. I pulled on a jacket and crept outside. The night air was crisp, and the street was eerily quiet. The only light came from my neighbor's basement window, faint, flickering, almost like candlelight. I moved closer. The basement window was small, half buried in the ground. I crouched down and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure was slumped in a chair, their arms tied behind their back. Their head lolled forward, long hair covering their face. A shadow moved across the room, my neighbor. He stood behind the figure, holding something in his hand. A knife. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to do something. Call the police, run, something. But before I could move, the basement light went out. And I heard the sound of the back door unlocking. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The soft click of the back door unlocking sent a wave of panic through me. Had he seen me? Was he coming outside? I didn't wait to find out. I turned and bolted toward my house, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Every step felt too loud, too slow, like I was running through a nightmare. My fingers fumbled with the doorknob, and for a terrifying second, I thought I wouldn't make it in time. But then the door swung open, and I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the door, listening. Silence. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I peeked through the peephole. He was standing at the edge of my porch. The dim glow of the street lamp cast shadows over his face, but I could still see those hollow, sunken eyes staring straight at my door. He didn't knock. Didn't speak. Just stood there, waiting. I gripped my phone and typed out 911, my thumb hovering over the call button. Then, as if he could sense it, he stepped back. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed by the door for what felt like hours before I finally moved. My hands were still shaking as I locked every window, drew every curtain. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that maybe he had just stepped outside for air, that maybe the person in his basement was just some twisted Halloween decoration. But I knew better. A plan forms. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. Work was a blur. Conversations felt distant. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that basement. I had to do something. The police wouldn't believe me without proof. And even if they did, what if he got away before they arrived? What if I was wrong? No, I needed to be sure. That night, I made a plan. I would sneak back to his basement window. This time, I'd record everything. A video, a picture, anything that would prove what I saw was real. Then I'd call the cops. As midnight approached, I forced myself to move. I slipped outside, keeping low, sticking to the shadows. The street was empty. No movement from his house. The basement light was on again, flickering. I crept closer. Just a quick look, I told myself. Just one photo. I reached the window and peeked inside. The chair was empty. The ropes were cut. But there was something else. Something worse. On the wall, written in dark, smeared letters, was a message. I see you. And behind me, the back door creaked open. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The back door was ajar, swaying slightly as if it had been pushed open just moments ago. The night was deathly silent, no wind, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own panicked breathing. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and bolt back to my house. But my legs wouldn't move. It felt like I had been paralyzed by fear, my body betraying me at the worst possible moment. Then, from inside the house, I heard it. A soft, deliberate chuckle. The sound sent ice down my spine. It wasn't amused, wasn't natural, it was knowing. Like he had been expecting me. I took a slow step back, careful not to make a sound. If I could just slip away, maybe he wouldn't. Too late. The door burst open with terrifying speed, and before I could react, a hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. I barely had time to gasp before I was yanked inside. The world spun as I was dragged forward, my shoulder slamming into the doorframe. The next few seconds were a blur of struggling, kicking, clawing, trying to break free. But his grip was inhumanly strong. I caught a glimpse of his face in the dim light, his sunken eyes wide with a sick kind of excitement, his thin lips stretched into a smile that sent a wave of nausea through me. Then, everything went black. The basement. I woke up to the cold touch of concrete against my face. My head throbbed, and when I tried to move, I realized my wrists were bound behind my back. The sharp bite of rope dug into my skin. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and something else, something metallic. Blood. My stomach twisted as I slowly lifted my head. The basement was worse than I had imagined. Rusty tools lined the walls, their edges stained dark. A table in the corner was covered in things I didn't want to look at. And then there was the chair, the same one I had seen before, now positioned in the center of the room. I wasn't alone. A girl sat across from me, bound just like I was. She looked young, maybe early 20s. Her face was streaked with dried tears, and when our eyes met, I saw nothing but sheer terror. He's coming back, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He always comes back. My heart pounded. I struggled against the ropes, trying to loosen them, but they were tied too tight. Footsteps creaked from above. She let out a choked sob. Oh God. Please, please, you have to. The basement door swung open. And he was there, standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at us with that same hollow smile. Looks like we have a new guest, he said, his voice eerily calm. Then, slowly, he started to descend the stairs. I thrashed against the ropes, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The girl beside me whimpered, squeezing her eyes shut as the man took slow, deliberate steps down the basement stairs. He was in no rush. He enjoyed this. When he reached the bottom, he took a moment to survey us, tilting his head like a curious animal. The dim light overhead cast deep shadows over his face, making his hollow eyes seem even darker. You know, he said, his voice disturbingly soft, it's always interesting when someone gets too curious. He crouched in front of me, close enough that I could see the cracked skin on his lips, smell the stale breath wafting from his mouth. You thought you were being clever, didn't you? He smiled wider. Spying on me. Sneaking around. I clenched my fists, biting back the urge to spit in his face. My body was frozen between terror and rage. The man turned his attention to the girl. She flinched as he reached out and gently traced a finger down her cheek. You're lucky, he whispered. He'll go first. Before I could react, he grabbed me by the collar and yanked me forward. My head snapped back as I was dragged across the cold concrete. He moved effortlessly, as if I weighed nothing. Panic surged through me. I kicked and thrashed, trying to slow him down, but he was too strong. He hauled me toward a steel table against the wall. Please, don't, the girl sobbed. The man ignored her. He shoved me onto the table and forced my arms above my head, securing them with thick leather straps. I fought, but it was useless. The restraints held tight. I gasped for breath, my chest rising and falling rapidly as the man moved to a nearby workbench. My eyes darted around, looking for anything I could use to free myself. But then I saw what he was reaching for. A saw. My stomach twisted violently. The man lifted the tool in his hands, running his fingers over the jagged teeth. He turned back to me, smiling. I wonder, he mused, tapping the blade against his palm, how long you'll last. I swallowed hard, my body trembling against the straps. Then he brought the saw down. And the power went out. Darkness. The basement was instantly swallowed by pitch-black darkness. The girl let out a sharp gasp. Somewhere in the room, I heard the man curse under his breath. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from upstairs, a door creaked open. My blood turned ice-cold. Because the man was still down here. So who had just entered the house? The air in the basement felt thicker now, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. The sudden blackout had disoriented me, but it was the faint creaking from upstairs that had my heart racing. Someone was there. Someone else. I strained my ears, but the only sounds were my shallow breaths and the frantic whispering of the girl next to me. "It's him," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's always him. He lets you think it's over, but it's never over." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't have time to respond before a low voice echoed down from above. "What the hell's going on down here?" The voice was deep, rough, almost angry, someone who wasn't afraid of confronting the man who had brought us here. I heard the shuffle of footsteps, the sound of boots on the stairs. And then, a scuffling noise, like two bodies colliding. My heart pounded louder than ever as I lay helpless on the table. Was this someone coming to help? Was it a cop, or another victim? But then, the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor cut through the tension. And there was a loud crack, followed by a scream, low and agonizing. My pulse quickened. Was it the man who had been tormenting us? Had someone actually fought back? The girl beside me started sobbing harder now, her voice shaking. "Please, please don't let him see you. You can't escape. You'll never escape." The steps from above grew louder, more hurried, like someone was rushing to reach us. The faint sound of conversation filtered down, but it was too muffled to understand. Then, through the blackness, a shape appeared in the basement doorway. A tall figure, limping slightly, like he'd been injured. The man. No, this was someone else. A shadow. A man who wasn't part of the house. "Hey," the newcomer shouted, stepping into the room with surprising force. "Where is he? Where the hell did he go?" I barely had time to process before the figure approached me, his hand reaching out to untie the ropes around my wrists. His grip was firm but gentle, and despite the danger, I felt a brief sense of relief. But then, a voice, cold and sickly, echoed from the darkness. "You think you're safe?" The voice was low, like a rasping hiss that made my skin crawl. The stranger's eyes darted around, his face growing pale. He moved faster now, panic in his movements. "What the hell is that?" Before I could respond, the lights flickered back on. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my eyes adjusting. And there, standing at the top of the stairs, was the man, the one who had dragged me here, the one who had planned for all of this. But he wasn't alone. Behind him was something far worse. A twisted, contorted figure. A woman, or something that used to be a woman. Her eyes were wide and empty, her lips stretched back in a grotesque grin. Her hands, long and clawed, reached forward as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the stranger. In a flash, the figure lunged. The stranger screamed, stumbling back. His legs gave way, and he fell to the ground with a sickening thud. The woman, or whatever she was, landed on top of him, her fingers sinking into his flesh like they were claws through paper. I watched, paralyzed, as blood sprayed across the floor in a horrific splatter. The man's screams filled the basement, but they were short-lived, quickly silenced as the twisted figure ripped into his throat with her sharp, jagged teeth. And then, silence. The girl beside me went still. The man, who had been tormenting us, turned his cold gaze to me, his smile widening. "You're next," he whispered. The lights flickered again. I could hardly breathe. Every instinct I had screamed for me to run, to fight, to do something, but I was frozen, bound to that table. I couldn't move. The gruesome scene unfolded in front of me like a nightmare come to life. The stranger's body was now motionless, sprawled across the floor, blood pooling around him in a dark, sticky mess. The woman, the thing, was standing over him, her head tilted to one side, as if admiring her handiwork. Her eyes were empty black pits, and her grin, if you could call it that, was wide and unsettling. I wanted to scream, to yell for help, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, the terror choking me. The man who had captured me moved toward her, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, it was something else. A sick amusement. "You're doing a great job, darling," he said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. The thing, the creature, turned to him slowly, her grin never fading. There was something wrong with her movements, as if her bones didn't quite work the way they were supposed to. She shuffled toward him, leaving a trail of blood behind. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough to send waves of dread through me. The man leaned in close to her, his voice a low murmur. "We'll get to him soon enough." But first, he turned to me, his eyes narrowing with that same cold, calculating look. "No one ever appreciates the art of it," he said, his lips curling into a twisted grin. "But you will. You'll see." I couldn't understand. I couldn't comprehend what he meant by art, or why any of this was happening. My mind was a blur of fear, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then, before I knew it, the man turned back to me. His hand shot out, and in an instant, I felt the cold steel of a knife press against my skin. I gasped, the cold blade sending a shiver down my spine as he traced it across my arm. I twisted in my restraints, fighting against the ropes, but it was useless. His grip on the knife was steady, unwavering. His movements were slow, deliberate. He was savoring every second. "You see," he murmured, his breath hot against my ear, "it's about control. About power." He chuckled softly, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "It's about making people understand the fear. The terror." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. The blade pressed harder, digging into my flesh, and I cried out in pain. "Stop. Please." I begged, but it was like my voice didn't matter to him. He didn't even flinch. The creature, the thing, moved closer, standing beside him. Her dark eyes never left me. She tilted her head again, her expression unreadable. She reached down, her fingers brushing my hair, her touch so cold it felt like death itself. The man smiled at her, a twisted look of pride crossing his face. "He's ready," he said. Suddenly, I was hoisted up from the table. My head spun, and my vision blurred. I was pulled across the cold concrete, stumbling on unsteady feet as the man guided me toward the back of the room. The girl beside me was still sobbing, her eyes wide with terror. She was whispering something, but I couldn't hear her. My own thoughts were drowned out by the noise in my head, the deafening scream of panic. Then, I was shoved into a chair. The man stepped back, admiring me like I was some kind of twisted display. "You're part of the collection now," he said, his voice almost gentle. The door to the basement slammed shut behind us. And then, as I sat there, bound, broken, and terrified, the sound of footsteps approached. He was coming back. But I knew this time, it would be different. I wasn't going to survive this. Neither would the girl beside me. There was no escaping the nightmare now. No one could hear us scream. The room was suffocating. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body shaking from fear and exhaustion. The man, the monster who had lured me here, who had promised suffering, was still standing before me, his twisted smile a constant reminder of the nightmare I was trapped in. The creature beside him, still unnervingly silent, lingered in the shadows. Her presence was like a dark cloud, oppressive and cold. I could feel her eyes on me, even though I couldn't bear to look at her. Every instinct told me that if I glanced her way, I would see something that would break my mind forever. The man stepped closer, running his fingers over a set of sharp, gleaming tools on a nearby table. His touch was light, almost affectionate, as if he were caressing old friends. The sound of metal scraping against metal sent chills through me. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Do you see why I do this? It's not just for me. It's for the art. The beauty in watching the soul break, in watching people twist and turn, fight and fail. It's like sculpting." He laughed softly, the sound far too pleasant for the situation. "But unlike the pieces of marble, you can feel it. The pain. The fear. It makes you real." I felt bile rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. My hands, still bound to the chair, were numb from the struggle. The ropes bit into my skin, and my head throbbed with the pulse of terror. The girl beside me was silent now, her face pale and hollow, her eyes wide but unfocused. She had given up. She had lost all hope. I couldn't let that happen to me. I had to keep fighting. But where was the fight? How could I fight when every move was futile, when the monster standing before me had all the control? The man circled around me slowly, almost like a predator sizing up its prey. He stopped in front of me, bending down until his face was inches from mine. "You're wondering why it's so quiet out there," he said softly, his breath warm against my cheek. "Well, that's because no one's going to find you. No one's looking. They think you've just disappeared. You're just a name on a list. And soon, you won't even be that." He reached out and wiped a tear from my cheek, his touch cold, like death itself. The thought of it made my stomach lurch. The finality of it. I wasn't just going to die. I was going to be forgotten. The world would go on without me, as if I had never existed. As if I never even mattered. "You'll beg for it to be over soon enough," he said, his voice turning darker, more sinister. "But that's the fun part. Watching people break." Then, without warning, he stepped back and gestured toward the creature in the corner. "She's hungry," he said, his eyes gleaming. "And she doesn't like waiting." I barely had time to register what he meant before the thing lunged at me. Her hands, sharp and long, scraped against my chest as she grabbed me by the throat. I screamed, but it was a sound that was quickly smothered by the pressure of her grip. She pulled me from the chair, lifting me with terrifying strength, and I felt my world spinning as she dragged me across the floor. The man's laughter echoed in my ears as I fought for air, my vision blurring. I kicked out, my body moving on pure instinct, but it was no use. Her grip tightened. And then, everything went black. I woke up. I wasn't sure how long it had been, but the world was darker now, quieter. The sounds of the basement were gone. For a moment, I thought it was all a dream, a nightmare that had ended. But then I realized that I was lying on the cold concrete floor, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. I could hear the faint, distant sounds of the man's voice, murmuring to someone, something. Maybe the girl. Maybe his next victim. And I knew, with a sick certainty, that I was next. But as I lay there, trembling and broken, a thought crossed my mind. This wasn't just a game to him. It was something more. Something that went beyond the act of torture. This was his world. And I was just another piece.